Welcome to the Determinetruth podcast.
Want the truth? You can't handle the truth.
Where we aim to explore questions of truth, the scriptures, and what it means for the church today. Here are your hosts, Rob Dalrymple and Vinnie Angelo.
Welcome back to the Determinetruth podcast. I'm Rob Dalrymple, and I'm here with Vinnie Angelo. Vinnie, how you doing tonight?
Good. How's it going, Rob? You can't say tonight. Someone might be listening to this at like 6 a.m. while running.
I gave away what time we're recording this, but
yeah.
So Vinnie, we want to look.
Hang on, no. How hot is it for you right now? Because it is nighttime.
All right, so I would be outside, but it's still 102.
At 9:30 at night.
If we do 2 episodes tonight, I'll go outside for the second episode, just because my daughter will probably want to go in her room and go to sleep. And Dad, quiet. And the office that I'm in has no door, so there's no way to silence this voice. And everyone always tells me how loud my mouth is and all that good stuff. So,
okay, Mesa, Arizona is hot. Then is what you're saying.
Yeah, it is, but it's a dry heat, so it's okay.
Oh yeah, so it matters.
Yeah, exactly. That's what matters.
Whatever.
So, we want to be looking at our first series of episodes here, Vinny, at the Book of Revelation. Obviously, that's kind of been my cup of tea for a long time, anyways. And I know you've been drawn into it through our relationship. And we've got some exciting episodes coming up. We've got some interviews that we're going to be doing with some top scholars and church leaders and things like that as well. But I want us to look just kind of at the topic of the Book of Revelation and kind of go from there. So if we were, let me actually begin with a question here, Vinny, for you. The people in your community, right? And I know, and if you were with us on the last episode, Vinny's at a Baptist church, Reformed Baptist, right?
Yeah.
Okay, because there's 1,000 Baptist denominations, so it does actually make a difference when you specify that. What would you say would be a typical understanding of the average person in your congregation?
Yeah,
the Book of Revelation.
Yeah, the average person by far understands it in the late 20th century popular model, which is everything that's been influenced by the Left Behind series and the popular notions of this is describing the end of the world in futuristic kind of ways. I oftentimes hear statements like, John just saw things and had no clue what it was, and so he wrote it down the way he did, but really it was, they weren't horses, they were army tanks, so he just didn't know what that is, so he wrote them as horses, or he didn't know what a Apache helicopter was, so he wrote them down as locusts. And so it's very much an understanding that it's something, Revelation is something that's looking forward, nothing that would have been relevant to the original context. And most of our folks would assume that we have a better time understanding it, or an easier time understanding it, than the original audience would.
Yeah, and this is exactly the world that I grew up in as well. It's sad. So one of the things I would say when it comes to understanding the Book of Revelation, of course, is the fact that we have this assumption that John was speaking to some future generation. And when we say that, we always say, which must be ours, right? We just happen to be the generation that are living in these times. And of course, the way I was raised, which I think you're expanding as well, was that we are that generation because we can take the book literally, right?
Yep.
So, the heavens rolled up like a scroll. Oh, that's nuclear warfare. And so John didn't know what he was describing, but he happened to be describing nuclear warfare. And so it's easy for us to take it literally and clearly supporting that that's the way to interpret the book. And the first thing I would say about that, Vinny, is that this is true about every book in the scriptures, not just the Book of Revelation. And that is that we have to understand the text itself in light of its original context. I mean, we take Paul and we go, okay, Paul was writing to the church in Corinth. What's happening in Corinth? Who's Corinth? Where's Corinth? Where's Paul at in his life? What's the situation behind this? And okay, now we begin to understand the book of Corinthians, and then we can apply it to our modern day, right? But for some odd reason with the book of Revelation, we don't do that. We simply go, John had some vision of some radical thing, and he's expounding some future thing that he had no idea what it even meant. And my response would be, if John didn't know what it meant, and if his readers didn't know what it meant, then how can they do what it says? And yet the book of Revelation begins with, blessed are those who, right? Chapter 1, verse 3. Blessed are those who read it and who heed the things that are written in it. And so throughout the book, you see all these indications of John saying, hey, look, if you have wisdom, calculate the number of the beast, because you know what I'm talking about. And so that this is a tragedy when we take this understanding to the book of Revelation and fail to take it out of its original context.
Yeah. And I know that, like, as someone who was fortunate to study under you for a number of years before I became, vocational in ministry, I definitely saw your passion and gleaned from you the idea that you guys like you and I, we're not and I'm cut from your mold in the sense we're not merely teaching the Bible when we're in the church. We're also teaching people how to read the Bible.
Yes,
and that's a passion for us, right?
Right.
And so I'm teaching a biblical interpretation class right now, and in the last week of the class is when we go through how to read apocalyptic literature.
Okay.
And I save it specifically because I want to make sure I get through Old Testament stuff, like what is how do you read the prophets? All those things build on Revelation, right? You need to understand the Old Testament before you get to Revelation. But I think one of the important things that I always say to my classes is, anytime I'm teaching a class, whether it's biblical interpretation or going through the Gospel of John or Daniel or Colossians or whatever it is, I'm always teaching in a way that I literally imagine that guy is standing next to me. And because I want to be faithful to the text, and I want to be able to look to that guy and say, okay, is this what you meant? And I'm not going to get it right all the time, but that's what I'm always going after. I always have that respect for those guys. When we don't keep that reverence towards those men that we would say God used to write these things, that's when I think you could also be a little more loose with it and kind of make it mean what you want it to mean. Not that there aren't, God-fearing people who might have might propagate that popular interpretation, and so it's we're not judging them in that regard. I just think it is an aspect that we need to keep in mind. Like, if I were to teach through Romans, something controversial like Romans 8, 9, 10, 11, like, I want to make sure that I'm always thinking, Paul, would you agree with this? And are we always going after that? And I think that's, gosh, is there any more book more relevant than the book of Revelation, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, and again, one of the things I say about that is there's nothing in the book of Revelation that's not taught somewhere else in the scriptures also. So it's not like this is some unique thing that's only taught in the book of Revelation. I mean, the only possible exception you can make of that is Revelation 20 and the reference to the millennium. Right now, Revelation 20 is the only time that we have reference to a 1,000-year period of time. I, however, and we'll do this in another episode, would contend that the millennium is taught elsewhere in the New Testament. It's just never described as a 1,000-year period of time. So the concepts, the idea, the significance of it. Revelation, Richard Bauckham wrote a book that's probably not relevant for the popular world and many of those listening, but he titled his book on the book of Revelation, The Climax of Prophecy. And that's very good description. The book of Revelation is this climax of everything in the biblical text from Genesis through the book of Revelation. And it puts it, and it's for the church today to say, hey, this is what you need to know, as much as it was, of course, for the church in the first century.
So let me ask you that then, because if you've only dropped into this part of the podcast and nothing else, you might be assuming that Vinnie and Rob are saying that Revelation only is something for the past,
right?
And there is a lot of it that describes the end of the world, and when we get into what apocalyptic literature is, we might unveil that a little bit. You see, play on words there, but there is an aspect of Revelation that does describe a second coming and a descent of a new Jerusalem and those sorts of things. So is there a future element of it, or is it all something that's happened in the past?
No, there is a future element without question, right? So, and I usually don't get into the different schools of interpretation, but there is a school of interpretation, obviously, that says it's only future. That's kind of what we talked about. That's kind of our backgrounds. And many of the people in your congregation in particular, it's only about the future. There's a school of interpretation that says only about the past. And that school of interpretation usually says, oh, it was all fulfilled in AD 70 with the Romans, etc. And the answer is no. Just like the book of 1 Corinthians was written by Paul to the church in Corinth, but it has abiding significance for us, right? A great example of that actually is for 2 Timothy, a clearly personal letter of Paul to Timothy. It mentions his mother and his grandmother, Lois and Eunice by name. And every single time throughout the entire book of 2 Timothy, the word you is singular. Paul is speaking to Timothy. You know the scriptures that you learned from a childhood, right? But the very last word in the book in 2 Timothy is grace be to you, and the word you is plural. And so you see, oh, Paul really realizes, okay, other people are going to read this. So it had this relevance to then, but it has this, as well as a relevance to now. So also the book of Revelation has this relevance then and has this immediate context of the first century, most likely late first century world of John writing to these 7 churches. But clearly it had a larger audience in mind. Not only that did they know that there were more than just 7 churches reading it then, but that this would be abiding for church throughout history. And so that would be significant in a couple of different ways. One would be the 7 letters to the 7 churches. Each one of the letters says, and all the churches will know, right? Or listen to what the Spirit says to the churches. So every one of the 7 letters ends with that phrase. This is what the Spirit says to the churches, even though that was a letter to the church in Philippi, or the church in Philippi, the church in Philadelphia, right, or the church in Ephesus. So you realize even the 7 letters themselves had this larger audience in mind. Then you add the fact that there's 7 churches, indicating the fact that they represent all of Christendom, and you okay, this has a larger audience in mind. And then the fact that like what you said, it clearly describes the second coming of Jesus, which has not happened yet. It describes the consummation of all things when there's no longer any mourning or crying or pain or death. That hasn't happened yet. So there is a future element of that. And the future element of that is important because one of the an apocalyptic literature does, and we're going to talk about apocalyptic literature and maybe our next session or session after that in more detail, because that's extremely important. One of the things that it does is it says, you need to endure now and hang in there now because your suffering won't be long, and here's your reward at the end of the day. Reward at the end of the day, right? You get to eat from the tree of life in the 7 letters, or Christ will come victorious conqueror and bring the consummation of his kingdom, is what gives us hope in the now, right? I mean, still, some Christians go, oh, we have hope in the now because we have prosperity, and it's like, no, what we're promised in the now is suffering. What we're promised in the now is take up your cross and follow me. But we're also promised in the now that there is, as Paul says in Titus 13, the blessed hope, the glorious appearing of our great God and Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. So there is this future element to it also. But that future element is not to give you information about the when, but to give you hope in the present.
And so in something like what you alluded to in verse 3, where there's a blessing for people who read it, it's in our translations who reads aloud, right? Which isn't in the original, but that's the way in the Greek that's supplied because we all read to ourselves now, right? But it's that person in the congregation who's reading it to the whole congregation, and then everyone who's obeying that thing, right? There's something significant not only for that person back in that original audience, but would you say that's something that carries on then for the life of the church and for the Christian communities who sustain this book?
Exactly. And in fact, when I was younger and reading the book of Revelation, part of my story is that everything was literal. It was describing nuclear warfare. Hal Lindsey told me so, and all that. And I was expecting all these things to happen, but when I read the book of Revelation itself, as I was, and I wasn't studying Revelation to study Revelation, I was studying Revelation more because I was looking at it in the way that Hal Lindsey or Grant Jeffries and all these guys told me to look at it. But you still get stuck in Revelation chapter 1, verse 3. Blessed is the one, the Greek actually says it's singular, the one who reads, which is that what you were saying, that there's somebody reading it out loud because not everybody has a copy of scroll. And, hey, pull out your scrolls. It didn't happen. Yeah. So one person reads. And then it says, blessed is the one who reads, and those who hear, and those who heed the things that are written in it, for the time is near. And I began thinking, well, how can they be blessed for doing what it says when they have no idea what it meant? In fact, John didn't even know what it meant. And this problem just struck me, and I didn't know what to do with it for a long time. But it clearly says that those who read it, which included John's readers, will be blessed if they do what it says. And that made no sense to me. How could they do what it says when they didn't know what it meant?
Okay. What do you do? And I'm just asking this on the fly. At the end of that sentence, it's the blessed are the person who hears and who keeps what is written in it, for the time is near. Like even a phrase like that. What do we do with that?
Right. So that becomes a problem. So if you go to these different schools of interpretation, right? that one school that says everything was fulfilled in the first century, they're taking that statement very literally, right? The time is near. It must be near when John said it, and therefore it has to have happened within the lifetime of John or shortly after his death. Therefore, everything's been fulfilled in the past. The school that you and I have become, that I grew up in, and that you're still kind of immersed in your church audience, that says, oh, it's about the future. They're going to take that statement that the time is near as saying, well, oh, and they're going to kind of read it in light of Mark 13 or Matthew 24, and where it says that when these things begin to happen, then this generation will not pass away. Now, I added to that, right? Because it doesn't say it that way. And I think we'll get into this some other time, but Mark 13 and Matthew 24 don't fit here, right? So it has nothing to do with this last generation. And when the last generation happens, it'll happen within a 40-year time span. If you look at the text, and this actually be a little bit of a complex exercise, what you'll notice is that John is actually quoting the book of Daniel. He's quoting Daniel 2, and it's hard. And he's quoting the Greek version of Daniel 2, and the Greek and in Daniel 2 is a vision of Nebuchadnezzar. By the way, I'm doing a class. By the time this podcast airs, I will have already done a session on this. But I'm doing a Wednesday night Bible study on Zoom, and if anyone wants to email me and get into these Bible studies, that they can. And we're doing Daniel 2 this Wednesday night. And Daniel 2 is a dream of Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and Daniel's told to interpret it. And Daniel says, "Okay, here's your dream." Remember, he's going to kill all the people, all the astrologers, because they couldn't tell the king what the dream was and its interpretation. And Daniel says, "I can tell you what the dream is, and I'll tell you what its interpretation is." All right, the dream is you saw this great statue that was made of 4 different parts. And the first part is the head of gold, and that's you, O great king. And like that's when you're Daniel, by the way, that's a good thing, because now the king's not going to kill you because you just said how great he is, right? You're the head of gold. You're not the feet, or the butt. You're the head of gold. So no problem. Okay, good. And then he says, but there'll be 3 kingdoms after you, right? And the 4th king, and these 3 kingdoms after you, they'll all be destroyed by the stone that's cut without human hands. Right. Well, what Daniel goes on to say is that that's the dream. Now, let me tell you about its interpretation. What he says about the interpretation is that the dream is, and the vision that I'm telling you about is about the end of time, about when things are going to end. Here, I'm opening up my scriptures as I speak here to cite it here. I'm gonna have to pull out my glasses so I can probably read it, because it is evening when we're doing this, and now I have to find out where I put my glasses. There. So it's Daniel 2. The first phrase is Daniel 2:28. However, there's a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days, or in the last days. Right. That phrase occurs several times in this passage. I think the very next verse. He's made known to you what will take place there. But then if you skip down to Daniel chapter 2, verse 45, at the end of the verse it says, he's made known to the king what will take place in the future. So Daniel has what will take place in the last days, what will take place in the last days, and then what will take place in the future. Right? If you match that up with the Greek of Revelation chapter 1, you'll see that John's actually quoting what will take place in, but instead of saying the latter days, he adds the word shortly. All right? In other words, what will take place shortly or quickly. All right. So what John's saying, and the best way to read it, of course, is to say that what Daniel says is going to happen in the future, John's saying is taking place now. In other words, the quickly can be interpreted as like it's going to happen soon, or quickly could be a reference to the duration of it. And most likely John's using it in the sense that it's happening soon, and that happening soon has already actually begun, especially when you read Revelation chapter 1 now, and you realize that the key evidence of what starts it all is the death and resurrection of Jesus.
I have
and
a
as we
question
go a
here,
little bit further in the book of go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, before it's moving on, is this similar? And I'm just throwing this out there so you could push back on this. Is this similar how in Acts chapter 2, how Peter interprets Joel chapter 2 and Day of the Lord language? And whereas in Day of the Lord language in Joel 2, it's in the later days. Or no, how does Joel say
in the last days?
In the last, yeah, and then that's how Peter's interpreting it as like, in light of the Christ event, especially in light of what we just witnessed in the resurrection or the ascension,
Yeah.
now look at these other things that are happening. Like we could read a fancy word, Christocentrically. We could read Christ at the center of the Joel story, in a sense.
Yes.
And so John is basically saying the same thing. Like, we can read Jesus at the center of the Daniel story right now.
That's right. That's why John changes that last phrase. So what will take place in the last days becomes what will take place quickly.
Mhm.
So he simply he's literally quoting, and if you look at, and I'll show you the document for your eyes only later on, that where you're comparing the Greek of Daniel to 3 different verses. I think it's 228, 229, and 245, or whatever that verse was. There, 45. All right, with Revelation chapter 1, and you see John's taken that identical phrase, and it's in Revelation 1, it's also in Revelation 22, and he simply changed the last word of it from the last part of it from in the last days to quickly. And you realize, oh, why? Because the last days are happening now in light of the Christ event. And the key evidence in the book of Revelation that the Christ event is the catalytic event that begins it all is the fact that the Lamb is worthy to open the scroll, right, in Revelation chapter 5, because he was slain. All right. So in other words, what happens now is taking place because the Lamb was slain. And of course, we know the significance of the Lamb that was slain is the fact that he's also alive. I saw the Lamb as if he was slain because, well, he's actually alive, but he was dead. And so that becomes the key, that the Christ event, most notably the death and resurrection of Jesus, is what begins it all.
Which is even something that is not even hinted at. It's explained in the last of the letters in chapter 3.
Yeah.
The one who conquers, I will grant with him to sit on my throne, as I also conquered. Right?
As I also overcame. Yeah.
Conquered, overcame. Yeah. So, well, how did you do that?
Right.
It was by death. So
that's
it's
right.
not by military victory.
In fact, Revelation 5 says, I saw a lamb that was, I heard the lion has overcome,
Mm-hmm.
but I saw a lamb that was slain. Well, how did you overcome? By being the lamb that was slain. That's your key. That's right.
Okay.
Yep.
So speaking of keys, then, what are some of the keys that will help us understand the book of Revelation? If it's not John seeing this crazy image of nuclear warfare and things in the future that he just had no paradigm for, so he had to describe it in other ways. If it's not John looking at the future, what is it then? How do we understand? What are the interpretive keys to understanding Revelation?
Well, there'll be a number of them, right? First off is you have to understand the context of the first century world in which John was writing. And that has implications on, and we'll get into some of that the further we go. All right, who's the writer? To whom is he writing? All right, John's writing, whoever John might be, right? And that could be disputed, but he calls himself John. That makes it easy for us. So we know it's John. Which John it is might be disputed. All right, likely writing in late first century, and it could be mid to late first century, but I tend to prefer a date in the 80s or 90s. And then what's the situation in these churches that's happening? So we have to know the historical, cultural, Roman, Greco-Roman context. But first thing that we would begin with is the fact that this is all about Jesus. It really is. It begins and ends with Jesus, the resurrected, glorified Jesus and who he is. And so the nice thing about saying it that way is the fact that no matter what our view of the book of Revelation is, whether it's about the past, the present, or the future, or all of the above, we can kind of all agree on this one, that Jesus is the glorified, risen Lord of all creation, the God of the Creator God who died on the cross and rose again for our salvation and sits enthroned in heaven, ruling over his people, right? No problem. We can all agree on that. The second key would be the fact that the imagery is not John looking into the future, but John clearly looking into the Christ event in light of the past. So I did a study of the book of Isaiah just recently, and one of the things I said about in that study is Isaiah might be talking about things to come, like this great restoration of the nation of Israel. But when Isaiah talks about the restoration, he's going to talk about it in this Egypt language, right? In this Exodus language, because that's kind of all he really knows. Now, it's when was God's people suffering under oppression? Oh, well, we all know the stories our fathers and forefathers taught us and mothers taught us about Egyptian slavery. And then we know about Moses liberating them. So when Isaiah describes the Israelites suffering under Assyrian bondage, he's going to describe it like Egyptian bondage. And when he's going to describe the liberation, right, he's going to describe it in terms of the Exodus. And so John's doing the same thing. The language of the book of Revelation is just coated with all this Old Testament imagery, looking at it, however, through the lens of Jesus. And that becomes the point of its fulfillment. Now, that becomes difficult for a lot of our people in our congregations, right? Because let's just be honest. You can open up almost any book of the Old Testament, and they don't know almost anything about it. And it's difficult for us too. I'm a New Testament scholar, so I have to admit, I go to the Old Testament, I'm like, okay, I got to review a little bit before I can kind of get into this book here. But those would be the first two keys. Well, the first three keys: the first century context in which it was written, understanding it in light of the Christ event, and then understanding the imagery as deriving from the Old Testament, but having a fulfillment in light of Christ that may also have a future element to it also, right? So does that help?
No, I think that is helpful. And I know for me, when I personally started hearing those sorts of concepts, I actually struggled with that because I probably heard that before hearing you teach on that.
Okay.
I don't know. It was around the same time, right? Where maybe you affirmed something I heard from someone else, or maybe I heard it first from you. No, I actually heard it from someone else first, because I heard it more in a theological context.
Okay.
So it was done more from the millennium and that sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
Because you were probably the first person who exposed me to just getting into the book itself and kind of stripping it from having to make it a jigsaw puzzle and having to make it fit with the rest of the Bible.
Yeah.
And so I remember when I heard this sort of thing from more of a theological construct, it really kind of wrecked me, because I didn't even know that there was different ways of looking at this topic in this concept, whether it's eschatology or revelation itself. I know for me, because I had many trusted pastors and people who I had listened to who held more of the popular view, hearing anything else just kind of wrecked me in a sense, where it was almost like, well, who can I trust now? How is this guy deceived? And so it's helpful for me to go back to those times, especially when I talk about this topic in public, recognizing that you can never pull the rug out from underneath someone without giving them a place to land, and recognizing that, hey, there are many different ways that we could go about reading this book. We're not going to say that they're all valid, because we would both agree that, hey, some are just better than others. But there does need to be a sense of charity when we look at these. And to always remembering that. So what you and I are not doing is bashing other things or bashing other views, and recognizing that, like, hey, there are some, legitimate brothers and sisters in the Lord who we would say, hey, we get that there's a different perspective out there. We can still share the Lord's Supper together. Like that.
Sure.
Divide that.
Sure. Let me bring this kind of back to where you started though. So part of my story is the fact that I'm a little older than you, right? Mm-hmm. So I was born in 6 of 66. I always tell people now, it's like 666. All right. The irony of that, but nonetheless, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I was told by Hal Lindsey and Grant Jeffries all these things that were going to happen in the state of Israel. And 1948 was fulfillment of prophecy. The state of Israel was founded in 1948. That means it had to happen by 1988, because the generation is 40 years. It was really obvious that we were on this time clock. And so now you begin to, okay, that means this Armageddon, there's this popular understanding of Armageddon, that's about to happen. So the Russians are going to invade Israel. And then all of a sudden, the 1980s kind of came along. And remember, Hal Lindsey wrote a book called, I'm not sure if actually it was Hal Lindsey, another one of the popular writers. They wrote Armageddon 1980, and the last number was a question mark. Mm-hmm. So it was Armageddon was going to happen in 1980 something. We just don't know which year in 1980s it's going to happen. But as the 1980s group came along, all of a sudden began realizing, wait a minute, we're farther and farther and farther away from Armageddon, and by the time we got to 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, communism was in shambles. The Russians couldn't even feed their own army, let alone invade Israel. And I became totally disillusioned. So one of the things that happened to me with this popular understanding is the fact that I actually was totally disillusioned. Now, I look at it as a moment of grace where the Lord said to me, okay, you might be disillusioned about this, but I'm going to keep you in the faith. I wasn't disillusioned about Jesus. I was just disillusioned about what everybody told me the Revelation meant. And I came to conclude that no one knows what the book of Revelation means. All these guys have different ideas. They're all obviously wrong, because everything they've told me for the last 15 years of my life now, none of it's happened. We don't have nuclear warfare. We don't have the Russians invading Israel. All right. So I became totally disillusioned. Right? Then all of a sudden, I started getting into graduate studies and eventually a PhD in biblical interpretation, and realized, okay, that there are 27 books in the New Testament. You have to include the last one if you're going to have a PhD in biblical interpretation and New Testament studies. And I said, okay, well, let me do this. Let me go ahead and open up a popular commentary series, popular scholarly commentary series that I've used for almost every other book of the New Testament. And if you're familiar with commentaries, it's the New International Commentary on the New Testament series. And I loved it back in the 80s and stuff. F.F. Bruce was very influential in my teachings, and he was one of the editors of the series. And so I thought, okay, let me open up the NICNT, New International Commentary on the New Testament, volume on the book of Revelation, and see what it says. And I began reading. I'm like, hey, and that volume, by the way, is a little bit more futuristic still than where I am actually at now. But at the same time, it was very scholarly, and it says, hey, this is what the text is about. This is the first century world. This is the message of the book. I'm like, hey, this is fantastic. It's about Jesus and about the church being the arm and the witness of Jesus and bearing and following the Lamb wherever He takes us, and enduring suffering at the sake of the world, just like Christ endured suffering. And I began realizing, hey, this message is powerful. Wow. And especially the church in many countries of the world where they are suffering persecution. This is written to a community of people undergoing persecution or about to undergo persecution, and as a means of encouraging them to hang in there and be faithful. I looked at the footnotes and I'm going, and all the scholars are agreeing with this guy. I mean, okay, some differ here and there. And I began realizing, okay, wait a minute. And so I began to, okay, let's step back a little bit and start over again. And I began realizing this has an incredibly powerful message of the church then and the church now. And that is, Jesus Christ lived, died, and rose again for your salvation, that we might be the means through which God builds His kingdom. And now you go out and make Him known. I mean, think about it. The churches are called lampstands in chapters 2 and 3. And lampstands mean we are what the light stands on. So go out there and be the means to which the light is made known to the world. Oh, and guess what? What happens when that happens? When you do that, you're going to suffer just like Jesus did. But the one who, the Gospel of Mark says, the one who perseveres to the end will be saved. Or Matthew says that as well. Yeah. And so I began around, this is an intensely powerful message for the church. So sure, we can say, yeah, there's futuristic elements to it, right? There's the second coming in chapter 19, and you can maybe say, the millennium's future, whatever. Okay, but we can't escape the message to the church now that it's not about prosperity. It's about making Jesus known, and when you make Jesus known, you might very well suffer for that. Maybe go one more step here. I'm talking for a little while on this one, and that is, it's about being an alternative kind of kingdom to the kingdoms of the world. And that's exactly what the Gospels are all about. That's exactly what Paul's all about. Being an alternative type of kingdom than the kingdoms of the world. And that's problematic when you start fleshing out what that means in terms of living that out for the sake of the world, but doing so knowing that there is this ultimate reward for the faithfulness of God's people.
Rob, so much of what you're saying right now, you're making it sound like the majority of Revelation actually has application for the church today.
All of Revelation has application for the church today,
which is the way you popularly. That's a weird way of putting it together. Popularly, maybe if it was later or earlier in the day, I could say that word. The way you put it together is, it's look at what we get. It's almost like having a balcony view.
Yeah.
Everything else that's going to happen, and we don't have to deal with that stuff. Look at it's just like you're watching a movie or something, right? Because we're going to get zapped out of here, and we don't have to deal with any of the gnarly stuff that's in the book. One of my friends who's a pastor, he has a saying, and he says, your destination will inform your preparation. And so if you're going into the snow, you don't bring a surfboard. And if you're going to the beach, you don't bring snowshoes. and he uses that as a way when he's teaching through something like Revelation, to let us know, like, hey, this is actually telling us something and it's informing us how we ought to live.
Yes.
Not just because Jesus is going to come back anytime, and kind of like that notion where it's just like it could just happen anytime. So be moral, which I think is oftentimes it becomes like a moralism or a
Yeah,
behaviorism,
right.
right? But it's actually like what you're saying is like, no, stuff is actually going to get gnarly, and you should expect it to be bad. It shouldn't shock us when we actually have to go through trials and tribulations. No, we don't get a ticket out of here. Like,
Exactly.
and this, like, even talking about practical things, one of the biggest things that I think in my context, in the church context, is dealing with is an American church right now who truly feels like they're persecuted. And it's not that there
Yeah, I
aren't
know. I
like
know.
weird things happening, and culture is changing and all that.
We have
But
a Democratic president. Clearly, we're persecuted.
no, absolutely, right. And
Sorry.
and that's like, because when you've been sold this bill of it's just going to be easy, any little resistance you're going to experience anytime is going to feel like it's the end of the world.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, we at our church, we just brought on a new pastor earlier in the year, and he actually, he and his wife served as missionaries in China for about
Mm.
15 years. And they were literally in a situation where they were told one day, a couple of years ago, like, you have 24 hours to get out of the country because like they're going to come and arrest you guys. And they had to flee. They had kids. It's like, hey, kids, young kids under 10 years old, like, take what you can in this box, and this is all
Mhm.
this is China's all you've ever known, and we're splitting. When I asked him about that, like, hey, where is this at on the persecution level, he was like, oh, that was like at 2. And so for folks who live outside of
Yeah.
our immediate context, they just seem to have a much realer understanding of what persecution is, where I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, well, he didn't die, but man, like, he's really going through the ringer. And he's like, yeah, this is nothing.
Right.
And just kind of resetting the bar in terms of the expectation for what the Christian should expect in life, from a biblical framework, not from what we've been told. Because we have well-meaning pastors, and
Mhm.
I'm not throwing them under the bus. I'm part of the
Right.
local church. You believe strongly in what the church brings, and so we're not advocating at all for separation or anything like that. It's just, we are also products of our environment. We're products of the people we respect. And how often do we just hear something repeated and assume that that's true?
Right.
Rather than actually challenging it and realizing that, like, hey, well-meaning people could be wrong on stuff. And this is
Yeah.
probably an area where the church needs to take it a lot more serious, especially when it comes to the expectation of the Christian life and how comfortable that should be or should not be.
Yeah. Yeah. And my book, Understanding the New Testament and the End Times, the subtitle is Why It Matters.
Mhm.
And I think it matters so significantly and we're going to delve into this a lot more as we continue on in this series. If you think the book of Revelation is only about the future, and if you think that it means, okay, bummer for the world if they don't believe in Jesus, you better repent now because look what's coming your way. But good for me, I'm going to be at least raptured out of here. It leads to this complacency. It leads to apathy. It leads to almost an animosity towards the world. Like, oh, you guys deserve and it makes God this. It can make God a wrathful, vengeful God, which I think conflicts with obviously the description of God in the scriptures. Whereas if you begin to realize that the scriptures, the entire text from Genesis through the book of Revelation, is this calling of God's people to be God's people, to be the people of God, to be his image bearers, and to make him known. There's this missional call there. And the reality of that is, oh, and guess what? The world won't like that, because making God known means proclaiming that Jesus is Lord. And when you proclaim Jesus is Lord in the first century, Caesar ain't going to like that, because Caesar thinks he's Lord. But when you proclaim Jesus as Lord in our churches, right, to you, right, the reality is, I don't always like that, because I like being Lord myself sometimes. I like my power, my wealth, my security, my comfort. And so the gospel, and so we don't have to go to the book of Revelation for this. We can go to the gospel of Mark. If you want to be my disciple, take up your cross and follow me. And I think cross-bearing life of following of Jesus has been left out of Christianity for a long time, and in the American church, and in the Western, outside the Western world. I think that leads to all kinds of problems.
Yeah, a term that I know you're buddies with Michael Gorman, and I was
I wouldn't say buddies, but I
well,
know
yeah,
Michael
you know
Gorman.
him, yeah.
Yeah.
I,
Right.
I I'm I know him via his words,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so we had to read his work on
Yep.
Paul in one of my New Testament classes,
Yep.
and that was the first time I was introduced to the term cruciform.
Cruciformity. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's phenomenal.
and he uses that term so often that
Yep.
it's like this is actually such a powerful term, the brevity of it, and just how much it packs a punch in terms of everything that word uh, entails. And is there a more applicable word that
No.
the Christian ought to use and view themselves through?
Right. And let's make sure if you're listening here, the word cruciformity, he made up this word essentially, right? I don't know of anybody that said it before, Michael. What it suggests is being formed into the way of the cross, right? Which is exactly what Jesus says. If you want to be my disciple, take up your cross and follow me. We're being formed in the image of Jesus. And I think for many of us, in my experience, I'll just speak from my context, many of the Christians that I know and the churches that I know and been a part of, what that means is being nice, being a good person, loving your neighbor, and being, you said it earlier, being moralistic. But Jesus said, no, it means following me by being crucified to self and crucified to the ways of the world, right? John says, do not love the world or anything in the world, because if anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in them. And I don't know about you, Vinny, but that's a struggle for me every single day. And I think that's a struggle for our churches, because as far as I can tell, the American church doesn't look a whole lot different from the American culture in almost every single way. And we've justified that in all kinds of ways. And that's something that we'll get into later as well. But I think we've got to get back to it. And the book of Revelation is this writing to say, let me encourage you by reminding you that I was dead, but I'm alive forevermore. See, if you take the way of the cross, it's okay. Because if you overcome, you're going to sit down with me on my throne, just like I sat down with my Father on his throne. Oh, so and we'll finish it up with this. I'm writing a chapter for a book right now. I don't actually know a whole lot about the book and whatever else it is. I just know I've been assigned a chapter. And my chapter, which is due, I think, at the end of this week, so it's crunch time for me. My chapter is Hope in the Book of Revelation. Right? And when I first got it, I thought, wow, gosh, where are you gonna find? I'm like, where are you gonna find hope in the book? I'm like, no, the whole thing's about hope. That's what it's all about. It's the whole thing.
It's a softball.
But I initially was thinking of, from this futuristic context that I think that we grew up within, there's not a whole lot of hope in it, other than, well, someday I'll get raptured out of here. But when you realize, no, the whole book is saying you can hang in there and you can endure, because I hung in there and they crucified me, but I rose again. And if they do that to you, guess what? You'll rise again as well.
So basically, you're saying you should follow the Lamb wherever he goes.
That's, we should write a book and title it "Follow the Lamb."
So I was actually just going to say, as we are wrapping this up, and someone is maybe they've been intimidated, they've not wanted to study the book of Revelation. I come across this all the time when I teach hermeneutics, biblical interpretation, where people are scared of this book. I've had people literally not come to the class that deals with the book of Revelation because they grew up in a fire and brimstone. There's like legitimate PTSD surrounding this book, right? Yes. So someone has listened to this podcast for the last 43 minutes and said, okay, you got me. You've challenged me. I'm willing to go outside my comfort zone. I'll read the book, but I just read it and I don't know what to do with this thing.
Right.
What are some of the tangible steps someone could take in terms of looking at some other, like, I'll plug your book for you, Follow the Lamb, a guide to reading, understanding, and applying the book of Revelation. Like, I just think that's a fantastic book that when I'm scheduled to teach through this in a couple years at my church in a Sunday school environment. Like, this is going to be one of the books that we, use as a, just as a help. What are some of the other things that you think help at the layperson level, especially?
Well, you're going to have to get something to help you guide you through it, right? Because A, we probably take too much baggage with us, and it's probably impossible to get rid of that baggage and read Revelation any other way. B, it is apocalyptic, and we don't know how to deal with apocalyptic, which we'll do probably in our next podcast, right? What's an apocalypse, and what does apocalyptic mean? Which, by the way, I would say, as a hint to our next podcast, Guess what? Almost all the New Testament is apocalyptic, or not all of it, but large portions of it are. And in fact, Jesus' parables were almost always apocalyptic. So we have to have some kind of guides to help us through it, whether it's my book or others. And Michael Gorman has a great book, Reading Revelation Responsibly, and maybe we'll put in the show notes some links to some other kind of good books. I did a podcast on the same link here, where I went through each chapter in the book of Revelation, one chapter at a time. So it's about 20 something odd podcasts. There's a couple times where I doubled up, and a couple times where I maybe did 2 podcasts on one chapter, and they're all 20 minutes long. It's not like I'm going to spend an hour verse by, because I think that's more, it's not as helpful. So in 20 minutes, here's Revelation chapter 1. Okay, now go read it and see what you can do with it. So those are places to start with. And then the next thing would be just to simply go, okay, now learn to read the book of Revelation in light of the New Testament, in light of, hey, okay. And so let's we'll do some more podcasts and just you and I together here in the next couple of weeks, to kind of help them go some next steps. But that's kind of where I would say start with a good source to kind of help you, introduce you to it, and get a foundation for where you can then go read it on your own, and then go read it on your own.
I'm Shayla and I right now are in the process of buying a new car. So we had there's no cars in America right now. So you have to we had to order it. And so it's going to be shipped here. And this is going somewhere, by the way.
Okay.
But so we're getting a new Toyota Highlander.
Okay.
We're excited about. And wouldn't you believe it? There's Toyota Highlanders everywhere now when I'm driving around town.
Oh yeah.
They've all popped up out of
nowhere.
Where
right.
did all these things come from? It's because I'm looking for it, right?
That's right.
If assuming someone is going to maybe read some of these other helps and they're going to actually read through Revelation, but like you talked about the baggage that they're bringing to it, what's a way they could correct that baggage? What are the things that they could look for? What's the Toyota Highlander in Revelation that they should be looking for?
What was John saying to his readers, and what did he want them to think or to do? If we can get to that question and answer that question, and it's hard, it'll be difficult at times, and sometimes it'll be easy. So then I think that becomes the nugget that begins to unlock the doors.
Very good. So it's not how does this play out in the future? It's what's John trying to say to them then, and
that's what you do with Ephesians, though, right?
Exactly.
That's what you do with every other book of the scriptures.
Yeah,
and we should do that with Isaiah too, right? We should do that with any of the prophets, because you begin realizing, oh, Isaiah was actually talking to the people of his day. Yeah, wasn't just looking forward 700 years to the Christ event.
Yeah, and if it didn't mean anything to them, like you said, how are they going to be blessed to obey it when they literally have no concept of what he's talking about? It's kind of an empty blessing, right?
Absolutely. All right, hey, thanks, Vinnie, for this time. We want to thank all of you for joining us tonight, or from this morning, or whatever time of day it is you were listening, and that you were edified by this. I hope that you'll subscribe to the Determined Truth podcast, and find us on anywhere you find your podcasts. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. Please subscribe to and like our podcast. You can follow Rob's blog at determinetruth.com or purchase his books on amazon.com. See you next time.